In this video, we're going to be breaking down how a 29-year-old was able to purchase 37 homes in just 3 years. Is it possible for the everyday Australian? And what are some strategies that you can realistically use to create wealth in your own journey? We're going to pull this all apart in today's video. If you're looking for a Brisbane-based buyer's agent, head over to purposeproperty.com.au to book in a free chat with myself. Alright, let's dive into this article. A 29-year-old failed cricketer and amateur model has attained 37 properties worth $13 million in just 3 years after claiming to have cracked the code of the Australian housing market. Let's see what he's done to crack the code. So Sanjay Parashar was a promising fast bowler in his teens. We don't need the backstory. He has since built a property portfolio of 37 homes spread around New South Wales, with one block of units earning him $2,500 a week in net cash flow after his mortgage and other holding costs are paid. That's a lot of net cash flow just from one block of units. Mr. Parashar attributed part of his success to buying properties through a company he set up as a special purpose vehicle for real estate investments. This improved his borrowing capacity. He added that the true light bulb moment that allowed him to purchase so many properties was realizing he could get commercial loans for certain types of residential properties. So really, he's got a lot of capital behind him if he's doing commercial loans for residential properties. Because getting approval for these commercial loans was predicted on the cash flow that could be generated from the properties through the rents, not solely on his personal income. Well, that is very true. Commercial loans can largely be based on the rental income, otherwise known as a lease doc loan, but you need the capital. You need 25 to 35% of a deposit to put the money down on these properties. And so in Sanjay's case, we're making the assumption that he has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in cash, which he is then putting into a special purpose vehicle. So he's obviously a business owner. And then he's using those funds as deposits on commercial properties, which are large residential properties of 5+ units. The types of properties where these loans were an option were blocks of multiple units. A block of 5 or more units is considered commercial property. So they are valued purely on the income they get, not the surrounding sales. Buying them together, you get each unit cheaper and there's multiple sources of income. Now, all of those things are true. I personally own a unit block with 5 units, but it doesn't mean it's an easy purchase. You still need, as he's saying here, to get a commercial property loan, banks demand higher deposits in the realm of about 30 to 35%. Most people don't have that in cash or even in equity, and getting a commercial loan is a hard process. The upside is that I'm usually not competing against many other buyers. So Emily and I have gone through this. We purchased our unit block in 2021 and we purchased a $1.4 million unit block in Coffs Harbour. It's located between Jetty Beach and the centre of town in Coffs Harbour. So we picked a prime location in terms of the Coffs Harbour regional market. Now for us, we used commercial finance to fund our Coffs Harbour unit block purchase, but it certainly wasn't easy in terms of obtaining that 30 to 35% as a deposit plus covering closing costs to secure that asset. We were able to achieve that through refinancing equity. We didn't necessarily have the cash. We just started Purpose Property, our buyer's agency, around that time. And so we were expanding the property portfolio from around that $3.5 to around that $5 million mark. And so when we made that purchase, we actually refinanced 3 of our residential properties, pulling out $250,000 of cash from each asset, and we needed to be able to service that debt to pull out that equity. And then we used about $500 of that $750,000 in cash as a deposit and to cover the closing costs on our unit block purchase. Now, the reason we hadn't been able to rinse and repeat and buy lots of unit blocks is we didn't have the capital or the serviceability to pull out all that equity. And so it's very capital intensive what this guy is doing, and it's unrealistic for pretty much everyday Australians. Buying unit blocks and having that capital available to you is not really going to be there for most Aussies. Most Aussies are only going to have $100, $200, maybe $300,000 in savings and equity that they can leverage and continue to build the asset base. And that's why we've built out most of our portfolio in the residential space. You get better leverage, you get better access to more lenders, and you don't don't need as much capital down. You're generally moving to this commercial space and larger asset values when you've got a lot of capital behind you, or you're making a massive amount of income in your own business. So let's read on. Mr. Parisher said he could afford these deposits because of his business acumen and extreme rises in the value of his first investments. The latter allowed him to draw down equity through the refinancing of those deals with the banks to use as deposits on new investments, which is exactly what Emily and I did. My second property went up in value by about $1 million in 10 months. That's ridiculous. I haven't heard of anyone making $1 million in 10 months. And the rental income, even after mortgage costs, was $100,000 a year, he said. Mr. Parisher understood he was not an ordinary borrower, and that's pretty important to note, that this is unrealistic. Even though they're saying 29-year-old with $13 million worth of property, he's not an ordinary borrower. He's probably the highest paid podiatrist in the country, noting he took home $1 million in pre-tax income 1 year. And he might actually be taking home more money than $1 million pre-tax a year, because if he's using a special purpose and bucket companies, he might be pushing money out of his business into these special purpose vehicle companies and therefore paying less tax in terms of building his wealth, and also gaining leverage with the commercial banks by using the company, because a lot of those banks, when you buy commercially, want you to buy with a company. So he's probably getting access to more leverage here and trying to pay a little bit less tax through his personal name, and that's why he's been able to grow that asset base so fast, because he has so much cash and liquidity available to him. He said he poured most of his income into deposits for his block of units starting in 2020. He must have been making a lot of money to be pouring lots of money as deposits on each of these unit blocks. Many of his properties are rented out on short-term letting sites like Airbnb to boost the rental income. And that's going to help even further. If he's buying blocks of units in really sought after locations, think of the Gold Coast, maybe in Sydney, maybe in Melbourne, and he's buying in prime locations where you've got travelers as well, and he's using commercial funding, and then he can supercharge the rents with Airbnb short-term accommodation. He's going to be making a ton of money because he's essentially running businesses here. When you do the long-term rental market, you're making a long-term investment. But if you're running an Airbnb, you are running a business. And so he's making more active income on these properties. Some observers of Mr. Parisher's approach showed how cashed up investors were contributing to some of the country's housing affordability challenges. And I can't disagree there. If you're turning residential stock into Airbnb, which is short-term accommodation, of course, this is taking away from people being able to buy these properties or the long-term rental market. But investors want the opportunity to make hotel-like stock in the Airbnb market and to make a higher return on their investment. And so we've got this system where the government can't really backtrack on these properties, but some councils are trying to do this. I've heard of Byron Bay only allowing 90 days of short-term letting unless you live in the property. So there are councils out there that are taking action against investors doing short-term accommodation all year round. But I think this is going to be a continual battle, and then we're not going to see the end of people wanting to do Airbnbs, because people are trying to make income and better their future. And so if they're willing to be active and take on a hotel style approach and run an Airbnb, they're going to get the reward of that higher income. Everyone has a right to wealth, and investors are an important part of the system, but equally, if those properties had families in them, including key workers, it would be a far better outcome, he said. There's always going to be a battle between renters, owner-occupiers, and investors, because everyone wants what's best for them. And so investors are trying to maximize their returns, renters are looking for an affordable place to stay, and owner-occupiers generally don't want short-term accommodation next to them, and they're going to be more incentivized to want more owner-occupiers in their suburb to make it more family friendly. So these different stakeholders are going to have different motives, and that's why we're always going to see people arguing or disagreeing around whether we should or shouldn't have short-term accommodation, and even whether people should be able to own multiple investment properties. Personally, to add to that, I'd rather mum and dad investors continue to own investment properties in Australia rather than big companies like BlackRock and Vanguard buying up entire suburbs and owning all the rental stock in kind of a monopoly scenario. So to wrap this up, we get a lovely, model shot of Sanjay here on the beach, which I don't think is quite necessary, but obviously realestate.com thinks this adds to the article. But here's what we've come for: Sanjay's formula. So Sanjay's formula to become rich and make wealth through property. So use a company specially set up for property purchases rather than buying in your name to get tax and lender benefits. Now, the first point on Sanjay's formula is not going to apply to most Australians. Now, using a company and or trust structure is adding complexity to your property portfolio. So unless you feel like you need a company, you're a high net worth individual, you're a business owner that's making $300, $500, $1,000 plus a year, then you're unlikely to need to set up a separate bucket company or a special purpose vehicle, or even set up trust structures unless you're wanting to boost borrowing capacity in certain circumstances. But for most everyday Australians, you're going to find that you're going to buy your first 2 to 3 properties in personal names. The reason is you'll get higher land tax thresholds in most states, and it's simpler in terms of lending. Once you're getting around that 2 to 3 mark in terms of those properties in your personal names, most Australians might start looking at a trust structure, and you're going to be wanting to focus on buying a property in a trust structure that has higher cash flow. The reason being is the losses are housed in the trust and you can't get the negative gearing benefits. And that's where buying a unit block with a company and trust structure can be a great idea. Now, you need to look at this with your broker and take your own personal circumstances into account. But he's told me, on Sanjay's formula in terms of how to create wealth through property, creating a company would not be top of my list for most Australians. Buying properties with multiple sources of revenue and looking for ways to improve them. Now, I definitely agree with that as part of the formula. If you can buy multiple sources of income, you're obviously going to have higher rental return. And if you're looking for ways to improve those properties, then you're manufacturing value as well. So in Sanjay's case, he might be buying, say, a $2 million unit block. He's then getting, say, 5 or 6 rents on that property. He's then also potentially renovating these properties and putting them out on Airbnb, which is creating more active income. Or he's renovating these units and increasing the income, which increases the valuation, which allows him to refinance out equity and continue growing the asset base. So I love the idea of also having manufactured value and market growth. And that's something I do personally in my portfolio. And Emily and I have done on every single property throughout our journey to create significant wealth and to keep building our asset base. Number 3 on the list is no negative gearing. Rents from each property should be higher than the mortgage costs. Now, that is almost impossible for everyday Australians buying a bread and butter residential home here in Australia. If we take the assumption that you've got a 6.5% interest rate at the moment and you've got 80% debt, so you're putting a 20% deposit down, and you're buying a house somewhere between $600,000 to $1.2 million, then you are going to be negatively geared. The reason being is that the income or the average yield on that type of property is not going to cover the debt that we now have at these higher interest rates. So it's all well and good for him to say no negative gearing and the rents for the property should be higher than your mortgage costs. But for everyday Australians looking to build a property portfolio, negative gearing can be a valid part of your journey in building your asset base. And that's my personal approach. So for Emily and I, we bought 3 blue chip houses with capital growth potential and value add potential. So we wanted to manufacture equity and let the market do a lot of the heavy lifting as well. And so each of those properties to begin with were negatively geared. And as we refinanced and put out equity against those properties, we did have negative cash flow. Now, we also wanted to boost the rental incomes, and so we did some renovations on those properties, which increased the rent and increased the values. And so over time, you can pay down some of the debt. You can then look to buy properties with multiple dwellings, like we bought our unit block as our 4th property purchase. And then you can balance out that capital growth and cash flow. But for most Aussies, you're going to want to start with the capital growth first, which does mean potentially negative gearing on maybe properties 1, 2, and 3. And then like Emily and I did, buying a unit block and buying a higher cash flow asset and going back and selling some of those growth assets once they've done what they need to do for you in terms of your property journey. Number 4 on the list is get commercial property loans, which are assessed more on cash flow than your own serviceability. Now, this is going to be quite difficult for most everyday Australians because like we spoke about earlier, they're unlikely to have the cash or the capital to put down funds for commercial property loans. It's only going to be people like Sanjay, who's running the most successful podiatrist company here in Australia, or they're earning massive amounts of income, that are going to have the cash and the equity to take on these commercial loans and then put the money down and then get positive gearing on these types of high income assets, which have 5, 6, 7, 8 units on the one block and on the one title. So it's unachievable for most everyday Australians to dive straight into commercial loans, but you can do what Emily and I did. We were on everyday incomes. So the first 3 years of me earning money, I earned $45,000, $55,000 and $60,000 a year. That then jumped to $80K, then $100K and $120,000 before we we jumped into running the buyer's agency. So in building our property portfolio to $5 million, neither Emily nor I earned over $120,000 a year in a single income tax year as we were building the property portfolio to a $5 million asset base. And people will go, oh, that's well and good, Luke, but you had lower interest rates back then. Well, that's somewhat true, but when we started investing in 2018, there was actually slightly higher interest rates. The interest rates were around 5.5% to 6% at that point in time. And interest rates came down over time towards 2021, 2022. And yes, you're not going to ever replicate the COVID boom, but it is still possible to build a multi-million-dollar property portfolio on average incomes. It's just a lot of work. You need to be active in your approach to adding value. You need to be active in picking the right areas for capital growth. And you need to balance out the capital growth and cash flow as you build out the property portfolio. Getting access to serviceability and working with the banks is probably people's biggest hurdle at this point in time. And so in the description down below, I'll leave a link to my broker if you want to get access to better finance and build your property portfolio faster. And if you're getting stuck, he can potentially help you there. Now, number 5 on Sanjay's formula is tap into equity gains through refinancing deals to purchase more properties. Now, this would have been close to number 1 on my list. And one of the reasons I'm sitting here today is Emily and I were able to work out how to tap into equity and how to use those funds to continue growing the asset base. This is why the rich get richer. They've got big asset bases, In Sanjay's case, he's already got $13 million worth of property in around 4 or 5 years. Now, for most everyday Australians, they're going to struggle to get past 1 or 2 investment properties. But if you're able to access equity, which is you require that serviceability that we spoke about. If you're able to access the equity and then you use those funds smartly to give yourself more leverage and continue growing the asset base, that's where you're going to get magnified returns. And this is why the rich get richer. If they've got a $10 million, a $50 million, $100 million asset base, and that grows by 10%, they're getting compounding returns on a much larger dollar amount versus the mum and dad that might have $1 million in their own home in the property market and no other investments. They might make $100,000 while the person with $100 million makes $10 million. The percentage return is the same, but the compound interest effect on the larger asset base means a massive difference in dollar value. And so you need to work out how you can tap into equity. Now, a lot of people will chase fast growth, so they'll chase hotspots and try and get fast growth that way. Now, my personal approach is to be a long-term fundamental investor and then maybe look to add value to each of my properties along the journey to create that faster equity and manufacture value. There's no right or wrong in these strategies. Everyone has different approaches to their property journey, but it's about getting you to that end goal. And Emily and I are an example of everyday Australians building a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. We got the asset base to $5 million before we'd formalized and really kicked off our business at Purpose Property. And the reason we were able to scale the property portfolio from 1 to 2 to $5 million was by tapping into equity and using those funds as deposits on future property purchases, also renovating to add value as we built out the asset base, which allowed us to fast track our journey. I've used this commentary on the channel before talking about stacker strategies. So you want to buy in an area with capital growth potential. You then want to stack on that the ability to manufacture value. You then want to be able to pull out equity and continue that growth story. So again, buy with growth in mind, add value again, and then pull out equity. And then you might want to go over and buy those cash flow assets like these unit blocks. So I'm a big fan of buying the unit blocks if you've got the capital, but I don't think it's realistic for every 29-year-old Australian to have a $13 million property portfolio. I am currently 29 years old, so I thought it'd be really interesting to break down my thoughts on Sanjay's journey, and congrats to him. He's done an amazing job in terms of his business and how that's traveling, and in terms of his property portfolio and being very smart with his money. And Emily and I are blessed to be sitting on a $7.5 million property portfolio, and we made 2 purchases this year. So look at your own journey, look at what you can do and what you can control on your side in terms of your income, in terms of building your property portfolio and creating more choices in your life. And if you want to sit down and have a chat with myself and you're looking to buy a property here in Southeast Queensland in the next 3 to 6 months, then head over to purposeproperty.com.au to book in a free session with myself. And if you're looking to buy across Australia and you're not looking for a Brisbane buyer's agent, then we also offer a course for less than $800. You can get hours of content breaking down exactly how Emily and I built our multi-million-dollar property portfolio. So if you're interested in that, head over to our website at purposeproperty.com.au and click on course. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Is it possible to still build a multi-million-dollar property portfolio? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and YouTube thinks you'll really like this video, so give it a click over here. Thanks for sticking around. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Peace.